Okay, I will ask everybody, just as a common courtesy, if you wouldn't mind muting your microphone, just so we don't hear your cough, sneeze, yell at your dog bark, yell at your children, all those things that seem to happen at every Zoom call in my house. I am recording this one as well, so this will be up hopefully relatively soon on that laplateextension.org website. But I do want to welcome Ben Bain. Ben is the La Plata County Weed Manager. He has been in some role with our weed office for a number of years. He started, he can correct me if I'm wrong, he started his tenure under Rod Cook, who was a long time weed manager doing some GIS work, some computer work, but has then progressed into this role. And we're super happy that the county is up in it and is able to pay for Ben to be with us year round. So he not only is able to do those site visits and weed management plans in the summertime, but is able to do opportunities like this with education in the winter and spring. So again, I know many of you have been on walks in the area and or hikes, and you're starting to see everything pop up. And we're going to be seeing probably close to 70 degrees this weekend. So we're going to see a little bit more green growth on plants here in the next couple of weeks. So with that, Ben, it is all yours.
Thanks, Darren. Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I've been with the weeds department 13 years. And like Darren said, I started out doing plant surveys and GPS inventory of the noxious weeds, and just kind of stuck with the program. And then after Rod Cook retired a while back, I took over the department. And so I learned a lot from him. He grew up in this area. He taught me a lot. And I've been in the Durango area for about 20 years. So I have a pretty good understanding of the different areas that we have, and just the different issues throughout the county. And just to put a number on it, we have 1 million acres within La Plata County, and we have one person in the weeds department. So there's a lot of ground to cover. So let's just get into it. Ultimately, as with most things in life, it all comes down to money. And that's kind of the biggest burden of noxious weeds. And CSU did a study trying to estimate the economic costs of noxious weeds and how that impacts agriculture, wildlife, and recreation. And they came up with about $14 million a year. So every local, state, federal government has a noxious weed program, and then the burdens on agriculture and wildlife, stuff like that, it all comes with a cost. Treatments are not generally cheap, and so it does have a severe impact financially. And some people think noxious weeds are just the plants that we don't like, but really the first rule of noxious weeds is that they are non-native. So they didn't come from North America, they came from some other continent. And so these non-native plants are disrupting our native vegetation and ecosystems. Noxious weeds thrive because they have no natural controls, and they're able to adapt to varied climatic conditions. They flourish in areas that have been disturbed and that lack native vegetation. And so partly why these government agencies are addressing noxious weeds is it's part of the Colorado Noxious Weed Act. And so this is a law that was enacted either in the late 90s or early 2000s. And it really breaks down the issues with noxious weeds and management strategies and requirements. And so every county in Colorado is responsible for some sort of weed management. And so we've actually adopted the language from the Colorado Noxious Weed Act into our county code. And it's something that we have to address as a local government agency. So noxious weeds have become a threat to natural resources in Colorado, as thousands of acres of crops, rangeland, and habitat for wildlife in native plant communities are being destroyed by noxious weeds each year. An organized and coordinated effort must be made to stop the spread of noxious weeds. The designation and classification of noxious weeds into different categories for immediate eradication, containment, and suppression will further assist the state in coordinating efforts to stop the spread of noxious weeds. So as part of that noxious weed law, they prioritized weeds into 3 different categories. And I had no say on what weeds are in the different categories. It's just kind of passed down from the top. A-listed weeds are pretty rare in our state and rare in the county in general, and so they're designated to be immediately eradicated. That way, we can kind of nip it in the bud before it gets a big problem and gets worse and worse. B-listed weeds are pretty common throughout the state and in the county. Every county has kind of different issues. We have everything from 5,000 foot to 12,000 foot terrain in this area, so we got quite a big variety of noxious weeds. And so these B-listed weeds are designated for required management. So it's not a one-time or immediate action, but more of a long-term successful management program that is required for these B-listed weeds. And then the C-listed weeds are listed as recommended for management, but there's no law, there's no rules that say you have to do it. But a lot of these C-listed weeds can be pretty detrimental, especially in an agriculture setting. And I'd just like to kind of go into what the weed office does. We do a lot of site consultations with landowners. We'll do a walkthrough with the landowner, and we'll just kind of take a look at the different issues that they have and kind of point out the good and the bad plants there. And I try to listen to their concerns and their goals and what kind of resources they have. And so this is a program that's available for any landowner, subdivision member, property manager. And so we identify both the noxious weeds and the native plants. And then afterwards, I create a custom weed management plan, which will outline the control methods for each species, the best time to control it, the recommended ratio for herbicides or mechanical methods, and then also looking at options for revegetation. So ideally native plants, but also grass seed and wildflower mixes as well. And so this is all at no cost to landowners. And then actually in the office, people can bring in plant samples for ID. Right now we have closed doors, they're locked, but you can still call in and drop something off if you want. You can email photos, and here's my email. And I'll kind of have all this information at the end of the slideshow as well. I'd like to bring attention to our website too. There's a lot of good information there, and I'm going to try to go in there real quick. So if you go to laplataweeds.org, we have our own website, and there's a lot of information here and there for identification. And then this education and resources tab is really beneficial. This cites that study that I just talked about. Really good sites for identification through the Department of Ag. The Bible for plant identification for a while was the Weeds of the West book, but that is now out of print. So luckily we have it in PDF form, so you can actually search for different weeds and kind of go through it. Turf ID sites, poisonous plants, which is really beneficial to livestock owners, and then Southwest Wildflowers. It's just a really good website. You can pick stuff by a flower color, and then different vegetation zones, habitat, stuff like that. And they even break it down to subspecies. People can call for questions too. And we get a lot of phone calls in the summer, and some people just have one simple question and they don't feel like they need to come in, and especially with COVID, that's understandable. We also provide educational opportunities. We have tens of thousands of weed ID cards and brochures. We try to do seminars like this throughout the season. We have a couple, 2 to 3 articles in the Herald each year. We also help people get certified to spray herbicides, either for a commercial license or a private applicator license, and then also providing a workshop for people that need to get their continuing education credits. We've also been working on and managing grants through the Colorado Noxious Weed Fund, and that's brought in a lot of money into the weeds department, specifically our cost share program. So it splits the cost of herbicides, materials, even grass seed and revegetation costs as far as just the material, so it doesn't cover labor. We also work with a lot of different land managers. There's a lot of public land in this county, and so we're actively working with the city, the BLM, the Forest Service, CDOT, and the state. We're also acquiring and testing various biocontrol options, and I'll kind of touch some of those areas further on. We also have about 700 miles of county roads that we have to treat each year. So that means 1,400 miles of roadsides. We have dozens of county properties to manage. We also work with the planning department by creating custom weed plans for new developments. That thought being, if you have noxious weeds in an area before development, it's probably going to get worse afterwards. So at least you kind of give them a heads up. And we have a herbicide applicator contractor, so they do the spraying for us. And then enforcement. This is a really convoluted process, as seen in this diagram. From the top all the way to the bottom is pretty much the process. And we were a little more involved with enforcement a while back when the budget was plentiful, but we've lost about 50% of our budget in 5 years, starting in 2010. And so we only have one person in the summer. It comes down to a lot of time and money to go through with this. And it's still an option, but it's very complicated. It's very costly. The county ends up fronting the cost for the treatments. And unfortunately, it's just not a one-time thing. You can't just spray their property and then it's over. You have to go in there multiple years. So that kind of ties into how weed management is not a one-time deal. Maybe if you have just a few biennials or annuals, you can get rid of them, once or twice. But some of these seeds will stay viable for 2 to 50 years. So the odds are kind of stacked against you if you've had a long-term problem with noxious weeds. And it usually takes 1 to 2 treatments each year for about 3 to 5 years to see a noticeable difference. And if you do it, really hard, 1 year and you let it kind of slide for a year or two after, you're kind of back to where you were. So you have to really commit to doing it as much as you can. Integrated weed management is the ideal kind of strategy. So it's not taking just one type of control method and just using that. It's looking at various options. So cultural could be avoiding tilling a field, because tilling in this area really disturbs the soil and can really make weeds thrive in those areas. Mechanical could be useful if you just have a few weeds, you want to dig them up before they go to seed. In some situations, you can mow them. And then biological, it's typically a insect type option to combat noxious weeds. And it's definitely more of a long-term strategy. And it's definitely, it depends on the situation. Sometimes they do all right, sometimes they don't. And then herbicide, that's another technique. And revegetation, that's maybe one of the most important aspects of integrated weed management. So you got rid of all your weeds and then you just have this blank slate, and it's pretty much a welcome mat for noxious weeds. So trying to get that area revegetated as soon as possible is really beneficial. And then just stopping weeds before they seed. So that's applicable to annuals, biennials, and then target perennials either at bud or fall stage. And that's more for herbicide treatments. So what are the causes of noxious weeds? Well, it pretty much comes down to these 3 categories. So there's drought, disturbance, and overgrazing. So since 2001, that was the year of the Missionary Ridge Fire, we've been in a long-term drought that's been, happening for about 20 years. Sometimes we'll get like a good snowfall or a good monsoon season. But overall, these plants are pretty stressed out from continuous drought. And then development, roads, plowing, just the modern aspects of industrial life. So you can kind of see where this great roundabout for CDOT, there's a lot of disturbed land here. And so the roadsides, when they're plowing, scraping the grass, when people, till up fields, it's all detrimental for noxious weeds. And unfortunately, we're just so dry. Like some places in the Midwest, you can till stuff and have have stuff planted soon after, and you get enough water to get it going. But out here, it just doesn't really work. When you till up the land, you're exposing the topsoil to the elements like the sun, the wind, and all that. Unmanaged dryland overgrazing. It's pretty significant, and it's just kind of a fact of life out here. But the more you overgraze an area, the longer it's going to be susceptible to noxious weeds. And grazing animals tend to eat the good stuff and leave the bad stuff. So they tend to eat the grasses down to the ground before they can really get taller and establish those deeper roots. And some areas have been overgrazed for a few decades. It's almost sterile, and you just have these kind of hardy noxious weeds growing in those areas. So we did a lot of plant surveys last year. We collected over 200 sites of noxious weeds, and this is kind of the breakdown of the top 5. So it was musk thistle, spotted knapweed, Canada thistle, Russian knapweed, and oxeye daisy. So I think most people are very familiar with musk thistle, and that's the one that I get the most phone calls about, and that's what most people can recognize. But going back to that list B list of weeds, there's probably about 20 to 25 list B weeds that we have in the county, and they're all designated for required management. So we'll break it down into 3 different growth cycles. There's annuals, biennials, and perennials. And depending on what kind of plant you have, it basically makes or breaks whether or not your treatment will be successful. So annuals, they only have 1 year to flower and produce seeds, and then they're done. And so there's 2 types of annuals. There's summer annuals, and so those are the mustards, lambs, quarters, pigweed, prickly lettuce, kochia, tumbleweed. And then there's winter annuals, and so those winter annuals start in the fall, and then they overwinter, and then first thing in the spring is they try to go to seed. So by the time most plants are starting to grow and get taller, these plants have pretty much done their thing already. So here are some of the most common annuals. And a lot of these are actually not B listed weeds. Some of them are C listed, but we see them very often. So flicksweed is a very common mustard. It has these kind of wider basal leaves, and then it's really easy to see after it starts flowering, and it puts out these really narrow seed stalks. Yellow sweet clover, that's pretty much everywhere. You see it all along roadsides and stuff like that. Luckily, we don't have to manage it. It's pretty much taken over, and it's more beneficial than it is of a detriment. It's a great early season pollinator, so that's not something we really go after, but it can be very invasive, especially in like a garden type situation or a disturbed field type situation. Lamb's quarter, this is another very common annual that we'll see after disturbance. And as with all these weeds, they're much easier to get rid of when they're small, when they're closer to the ground. Once they've pretty much gone to seed, it's too late. So once it's gone to seed, you can pretty much just collect the seeds if possible, try to throw them away. Pigweed is another annual, red root pigweed. Prickly lettuce, pretty common. You pull a leaf or a stem apart, and it puts out this white sap, and it has little yellow flowers, and it kind of puffs out into these cotton flights afterwards. And kochia, this might be the most tenacious out of all the annuals. It grows very quickly in any kind of soil condition, drought, no drought, it still does fine. And it's actually become herbicide resistant to common herbicides because people will spray it, but they won't kill it. And so, as with anything, if you're trying to kill it when it's like actively trying to seed out, it's going to be a lot harder to kill. And in some cases, you'll dig them up, and if it's far enough in its flower stage, all those nutrients from the plant will actually go into seed production, even if it's severed from the ground. And then Russian thistle. This is pretty much the weed of the West. It's everywhere throughout the West. And in the beginning, it looks kind of innocent. It has these stringy, kind of soft leaves, and then it has these kind of suspicious red stripes, and then it turns into a seeded out tumbleweed, and it'll turn tan and kind of fly away. So it's much easier to identify these plants as early as you can, get them out of the ground, spray them. Mowing can work as far as reducing the seed count, but a lot of these plants will just come right back up and they'll start flowering lower to the ground. Cheatgrass, this is a winter annual and is pretty much everywhere around here. And so it comes up in the fall. It looks like kind of nice tender grass, but it's going to become this seeded out kind of stemmy, worthless plant. And so if you see nice tender grass where you've seen cheatgrass before and it has a spiral shape to the leaf, that's often cheatgrass. And so what you're trying to do is you're just stopping this plant from seeding out, because that's the only way it's going to reproduce. And same with jointed goat grass. We got a little bit of it here and there throughout the county. And by the time you recognize it, it's mid-May and it's like pretty much seeded out. So you really got to target those weeds early. So biennials, these life cycles are typically 2 years, and there's a lot of different biennials there. Musk, Scotch thistle, hound's tongue, mullein, poison hemlock. So musk thistle, this is the kind of the biggest problem that we have throughout the county. One plant can produce 20,000 seeds. It's highly competitive, really likes to invade any type of landscape. It tolerates drought. And then one thing to kind of think about is some people will see after the plant has flowered, it will kind of put out these cotton flights, and they'll see these cotton flights blowing around in the wind. They think they're getting all these seeds, but actually only 5% of the seeds are attached to that pappus or the cotton flight. So just something to think about. But these seeds can last, up to probably about 8 years. So these biennials, they start out as a rosette. And so with musk thistle, it's kind of low to the ground. It's got a darker green color to it with a kind of white outline. These leaflets are symmetrical, and they're typically kind of flat to the ground. And so there's probably about 5 or 6 different thistles that we have in the county, and some are native. Typically the ones that bloom a white flower are native, so you don't have to worry about those. But depending on what kind of thistle, that kind of determines how you can deal with it. And so this is what happens just a couple of years after some disturbance, after a road's been plowed, and this stuff just takes over. So each one of these plants puts out about 20,000 seeds. And so what you're trying to do is you're stopping it from getting to this point. And if you try to address it when it's in full-on flower, it's really difficult to control, whether it be mechanical, with chemical. It's pretty much ready to go. And even if you cut it up, a lot of those seeds are still going to be viable. And there are a few biocontrol options for musk thistle. We have some of that throughout the county. Unfortunately, it's not really a long-term solution, or it's not really a defining technique to get rid of thistles altogether. It kind of stresses out the plants, but in the areas where I've seen it, it's just kind of keeping it, maybe at a baseline like level. So it's maybe not expanding, but it's definitely not. It's not going to kill all the thistles there. And then this is Scotch thistle. It's more robust. It has these wider leaves, and it's more of like a light green kind of grayish coloration. And this, is another rosette to biennial to flowering plant type situation. And so this is what it looks like once it's kind of taken over. And I've seen Scotch thistle grow 7 feet tall. It almost looks like Christmas trees. So once it's established, it's really difficult to get rid of. And at this stage, even though it's like pre-bud, it's hard to get equipment that can like mow through that stuff. You pretty much need a heavy duty tractor. And even then, like I say, once you mow down these annuals and biennials, they'll still come up. You're not killing them, If you have just a few of these biennials or annuals, you can definitely use a shovel and you try to get that taproot 2 inches below the soil surface, and then it's not coming back up. Whereas mowing, that stuff, you don't kill it, you kind of stunt it and then it comes back. And hound stung, this is another easy one. If you just got a little shovel, you can pop it at the taproot. If you can get it during this rosette stage, this is the first year stage, you won't have to worry about it. Eventually, this turns into a flowering plant. So it's typically purple flowers, sometimes white flowers, but typically purple for most cases. And it puts out these little nasty sticker seeds. So it can attach to all sorts of fabric and wildlife and grazing animals and stuff like that. So it has a real successful way of kind of getting its seeds out into different areas. Some places around Hermosa Creek, there's literally like thousands of acres of it. Poison hemlock. This is actually the most poisonous plant in North America. And there's two different types of hemlock. The first type is it's got these spots, and that's the poison hemlock. And then there's the western water hemlock. And you typically don't see that unless you're in an area that's like a wetlands area or riparian area. You see it a lot along ditches and irrigation canals, stuff like that. There's plants that look similar to it, so you just got to be real careful. I know that some plants in the maybe the carrot family or the parsley family look similar. Osha is another plant that looks similar to it, but it only grows up at higher elevations. And so because it's so poisonous, I wouldn't recommend hand pulling it, or if you're going to hand pull it, you got to wear gloves and make sure you don't get anything on you. And the roots are the most poisonous part of the plant. And then there's the perennials, and these are a lot more difficult to control. They have a different process of growing, and so some of these are short-lived, so they typically grow maybe 3 to 5 years, and so that's the oxeye daisy, the spotted knapweed, and then a lot of them are long-lived, so they have these deep creeping root systems, and the bulk of the plant is underground, and so they come back year after year. So oxeye daisy, we've seen it everywhere from, the lowlands of southern Utland all the way up into Kennebec Pass, which is at about 12,000 feet. And so it's very hardy. It can grow in pretty much any kind of condition. And it pretty much just dominates. So it reproduces by seed, but also underground rhizomes. And for every one flowering plant for oxeye daisy, there's probably like 5 to 10 that aren't flowering. So it's really hard to even control, because you'll see the flowering plants, but then there's a lot of rosettes that will become flowering in the next year or two. So they can produce about 500 seeds per plant. And then they're used rarely by bees. I think other pollinators like flies may use them, but drastically less useful than the resources of native wildflowers. And the best thing about native wildflowers in our area is the biodiversity of them. In some places, you'll see maybe 15 different species within a 10-foot by 10-foot area. And it also reduces or eliminates forage for wildlife and grazing animals. And so there's a few different daisies out there. There's natives that are asters or fleabane, and they're typically pretty small. And they have square-edged petals, whereas the oxeye daisy, it has rounded off petals, kind of thin leaves at the bottom, and then they get to about maybe a foot tall. And you can hand pull them, but they have such a big root ball that you end up kind of making a mess with all the disturbance. And so I'd recommend planting some seeds afterwards if you're going to hand pull or try to dig them up. And so this is what a monocrop of oxeye daisy looks like. And unfortunately, that's just not very good for the ecosystem. Biodiversity is kind of, the more diverse the biodiversity, the more healthy the ecosystem. And so we had a campaign a few years back. We're trying to educate people about the oxeye daisy, and it's especially bad around Purgatory all the way up to Silverton, and just trying to bring awareness. So this is an example where it kind of crept in, and then through drought, and a few years later, it just kind of dominates. And so these are examples of a mosaic of native wildflowers. And so there's different plants. They all have different purposes. They all benefit, different pollinators. So this is what we're trying to stop is, we're trying to stop these monocultures and focus on biodiversity. Spotted knapweed. Unfortunately, La Plata County has the most spotted knapweed out of any other county in the state, and it's just been here for decades and decades. Each plant can produce anywhere from 14 to 2,400 seeds each season, with a germination rate of over 90%. The seeds can remain viable for up to 8 years, and it increases in area up to 27% annually. They can grow anywhere from dry riverbeds to roadsides to range. It's very drought tolerant, and it typically grows for 3 to 5 years. So these are short-term perennials. And there's a few different knapweeds in our area. This one's relatively easy to identify because there's these dark bracts, and that's why it's called spotted knapweed. And here's an example of the older skeletons of the years past, and then this is the current plant as it's flowering. It's hard to identify when it's not flowering, but sometimes you can look for these old seed stalks and you can kind of see what it looks like. And once you're able to identify these weeds in their earlier growth stages, the better off, because you can kind of attack it before it's this beast. When weeds get more than about a foot tall, they're just always harder to kill, whether it's being hand pulled or mechanically removed or sprayed. Canada thistle. This one's a tough one, and it's very common throughout our area. The majority of the plant mass, 75%, maybe even 85%, is underground. So you can only see the tip of the iceberg. These plants can grow 15 plus feet deep. Each plant produces thousands of seeds, but only 40% are viable. But you still have a few thousand that could be viable. The seeds can last up to 20 years when they're buried deep. Tilling, disking, plowing just increases density. And it was cited as the most problematic weed in the US and one of the worst globally. And they came up with a number of $320 million of annual loss to prairie producers, and 15 to up to 60% crop yield loss too. So that's pretty significant. And what makes this so tenacious is these underground rhizomes and creeping root systems. So these plants are basically all connected to each other. And here's a kind of a bad picture, but this is a cross section of Canada thistle, and the majority of the plant mass is these roots. So you can pull it all day long. It's still alive and well. It's going to take a long-term commitment to remove it mechanically. And this is what it looks like when it comes up in the year, first of the year. So the plants will basically flower and then die off. And the next year they come from the ground again. And this basal kind of rosette is different than the musk thistle. Typically, these leaves come up at an 80 or a 45-degree angle, and the leaves aren't symmetrical. It's a little more pubescent, has like more hair follicles than musk thistle. And typically you'll see a lot of these. You won't just find one. You'll find a bunch of them together because they're all connected underground. And then this is what it looks like when it flowers. So it has a much different flower than the musk thistle. So these are a lot smaller, and it's a pinkish color. They typically flower later in the season. So you see it more in end of July, August, whereas musk thistle, you start seeing it June and July. So like I said, it's really difficult to eradicate organically. Disking is definitely not recommended. Tilling can stimulate new growth, and each 2-inch root segment turns into a new plant. So that's not going to work. Mechanical control can be done if you can keep up with it every 2 weeks for up to 5 years. So it's a big commitment. Contact herbicides that are supposedly organic. Um, it's more of a contact burn, so you burn the leaves, but you're not going to kill the plants. It's kind of a waste of your time. And I've heard that vinegar can kind of kill soil microbes and be kind of harsher on different aspects to soil health. We do have a kind of promising biocontrol option for it. There's this rust fungus. And so there's the Colorado State Insectary, which is at Palisade, Colorado. And they've been testing this out in some cases with pretty good results. I've been trying to get it going for about 5 years and not really having the best luck. It just depends on the environment and the rainfall and all these different factors. But we're hoping to get some stuff going on our own so we can produce enough of it to share it with different landowners. And like I said, biocontrol is not like a quick fix, it's a long-term solution. And the way this rust fungus works is it basically attacks the plant and it opens up all these areas to parasites and pathogens and stuff like that. So it just makes it more unhealthy and more likely to get attacked and die eventually. And then Russian knapweed. This one's really, really bad as well. It can grow 20 feet deep. It's growing during the winter under the frost line. It actually produces a chemical that kills off other plants. If eaten in large quantities, it can be poisonous for horses. It causes liver damage. Really hard to control. We've been testing out some different gall wasps and gall mites on Russian knapweed, especially on the dry side out by Marble and stuff, where there's thousands and thousands of acres. And we've found that it's actually they're reproducing and they're moving to different areas. So that's a good sign. But it's kind of like a drop in the ocean. And so maybe 30 years down the road, we'll start seeing more impacts. In some cases, Russian knapweed is kind of a ground stabilizer for the arid soils out there. So you get rid of the Russian knapweed, and then you're going to get something else: cheatgrass, field bindweed, something like that. And so, how hardy is it? Well, it's pretty hardy. It actually grows through asphalt. It can actually damage foundations for houses. And this one's a little bit different from the spotted knapweed. They typically have kind of a lighter green color. They're more bushy, and then the flowers are much different. So if you zoom in, you don't see those dark bracts on this. And so when you see it, you'll typically see this white and a little bit of pink on top. Yellow toadflax is another perennial. It's not as bad as those last two, but it definitely has an underground creeping root system, so it's very hard to control mechanically or through hand pulling. And once it's established, it's harder to get rid of. Leafy spurge is another big issue in certain parts of the county. It produces this toxic sap, and if you get that sap in your eyes, supposedly you can go blind. It's poisonous for livestock, and once it's established, it's really hard to get rid of. And then this plant is also hard to get rid of with chemicals. Most of the herbicides actually just don't work on that plant. And then white top, this is a early blooming mustard. You'll see it typically kind of start in late April and early May. And then by end of May, it's pretty much done its thing and it's seeded out and turns yellow. And not to be confused with yarrow. So this is a native, this is okay. It's got a different kind of flat top for the white flowers, and then these leaves are much different, if you compare them to white top. And then if you crush up these leaves, it smells like a nice mint smell to it. Field bindweed. This is another big issue in our area. It's a deep-rooted perennial. reproduces by seeds and creeping horizontal root systems. The leaves are distinguishable by their arrowhead shape. And these seeds can remain viable for up to 40 years. I've actually seen a study where they found it to be 70 years, but we'll just say 40 years because that's just too depressing. And so this is what it looks like. This arrowhead shaped leaf is kind of a dead giveaway. It's kind of a creeping ground cover, and it puts out these white and pink kind of flowers. So this is a C-listed weed. It's not mandatory for management, but it can wreak havoc in gardens and stuff like that. So methods of control. We kind of blasted through the different types of weeds. So I'd say the annuals and the biennials, you can get away with hand pulling, digging, to a certain extent mowing. And it's most appropriate for small infestations. And, if you have 10 acres of these plants, it ends up being a lot of gas, a lot of labor, and it's pretty much impractical. And there's chemical options. We always recommend to use a surfactant or crop oil. So it's kind of an additive that you combine with herbicides. And what these do is it breaks up the water surface tension. So water typically kind of sticks on a plant like a bead of water, so it spreads it out. Also makes it stick better to the plant. And we typically recommend a non-ionic surfactant in the spring and the fall when temperatures are cooler. Once stuff gets pretty hot and dry, we recommend using a crop oil or a mentholated seed oil. And this is an organic substance that is taken into the plant better. Since it's an organic substance, the plant is more likely to take it in, and it just helps it stick to the plant longer. And just want to reiterate that ideally you want to be, if you're going to be spraying weeds, you want to do it as early as possible. When weeds are below 6 inches, they're a lot easier to kill. If you can do it before drought, it's definitely ideal. If you can get it before the temperatures get up to 90 degrees, you're a lot more successful with these chemical methods. And it's probably best with even mechanical or hand pulling as well. And so what we typically recommend are broadleaf specific herbicides. And so this means they only interact with certain plants. And their mode of action works only on a handful of plants, and it kind of can target the metabolism. Sometimes it'll speed up the metabolism and make the cells burst and stuff like that. So the most common one is 2,4-D, and we see people use it a lot. It's very cheap. It's been around forever. But it's best used on these annuals and biennials because it's not systemic. So systemic means that the material will be brought into the root system so that the herbicides will actually translocate into the root system. So that's very important for perennials. And the 2,4-D, it's best if you spray it when plants are smaller. If plants are 3 feet tall and flowering, you're not going to have much luck with spraying. And if you spray 2,4-D on perennials, people get really excited because 2,4-D works really quick. And so you'll see the epinasty, so that means like the curling of the plant, and you'll see yellowing right away. But going back to those side diagrams of some of those plants, those root systems are 20 feet deep. That's what you need to focus on. And so there's some broadleaf herbicides that we recommend that are systemic. Milestone, Escort, Dicamba, Telar, Confront. This stuff is slower acting and will actually get drawn into the root system. And with perennials, there's basically 2 times when you can spray those plants. It's either at bud stage, so before it opens up those flowers, there's actually a 2-way nutrient flow. Otherwise, it's mainly just going up. And so you want that downward flow of nutrients. And another time to spray perennials is during the fall, right before a big hard frost. And that time period is when those plants are taking all the nutrients and going down into the root system. And so the systemic herbicide goes into that root system and kills the majority of the plant. There are issues with some of these herbicides. Milestone can kill trees if you spray under the drip line of the trees. And they're also residual, meaning they stay active on the soil surface for up to a year or two. And in some cases, that's preferred because you can spray an area, and then maybe later on the season there's new seedlings coming up that are weeds, and then actually will kill those weeds before they come up. But in some cases, it's so persistent that it'll actually kill grass seed that you're trying to grow. And so you should always read the label of the herbicide. Each herbicide container has a label, and it defines pretty much the use of it, what's good, what's not legal. The label is the law. And then there's non-selective herbicides. Most common is glyphosate, and this is also a systemic herbicide. And it's a slow-acting herbicide. And I know there's a lot of bad press about glyphosate for good reason. I think for the most part, the main issue is crops that have been genetically engineered to be sprayed directly with glyphosate, and then that becomes part of our food source. So it's really common with soybeans and corn and stuff like that. And so there's a whole range of possible health effects because of that. Glyphosate in your backyard, it's really one of the safest herbicides that you can use. And it's actually, it'll break down into the ground. The active ingredient becomes inert after about 2 weeks. And so you can actually plant whatever you want 2 weeks after. And it is a slow process, especially compared to 2,4-D. Glyphosate usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks. If it's been really dry or it's been really cold, it works really slowly. And glyphosate can be beneficial in areas where you just want to get rid of all the noxious weeds and you want to replant right away. It's also useful if you have these deep-rooted perennials under trees. And it's pretty affordable. You don't have to get Dow or whatever the company is now. They lost their license for it, so you can just get glyphosate pretty much at hardware stores, and in general, you can get all of this stuff at Base and Co-op, or you can get it on Amazon even. It's kind of up to you where you can get some of this stuff. And like I said, integrated weed management is very useful. So just kind of changing up your techniques and stuff, and just finding what's appropriate for your land. And you should really never rely on just one type of control method, especially if you have a bad infestation, especially with perennials and stuff like that. So revegetation is really important because once you get rid of those weeds, you have all these blank spots on the ground, and that's basically a welcome mat for the weeds. And here's some resources. This is our website again, Colorado Department of Ag, Palisade Insectary. We have links on our website for this stuff. NRCS, Southwest Seed Company, they're a great source of different seed mixes, whether they be native or non-native. Ideally, we would like to have all natives planted in the place of weeds, but it's really expensive. In some of these wildflowers, you can't find bulk seeds because it's so hard to collect them. And so a lot of times we'll recommend like a low grow grass seed mix, or a drought tolerant like dryland pasture mix that will do better in our harsh environment because it's so dry. And if you don't have irrigation, if you don't have water, it's really hard to get any kind of plant established. And so they have different seed mixes and recommendations, and you can buy these seeds at the Durango nursery here in town. And then here's my contact information. And yeah, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Ben. Let's go ahead. There's some in chat if you want to grab the chat first, if you want to look. Get started.
Let's see.
Maybe that first question is back to the cost share. How do you get the cost share?
Yeah, I'm not seeing the chat. Yeah, so we have a cost share program available for this year. To be eligible, you need to get a weed management plan. And so that's a free service. We basically will coordinate a time to go to your property, and we'll look at the different issues together, and we'll just kind of custom plan management techniques for your property. And then if you follow that noxious weed plan that I give you, you're eligible for herbicides, surfactants, and seeds at a 50% rebate. So you pay up front, and then you fill out a form. It's available. Well, it should be available on our website pretty soon. And you turn in that, you fill out the application, and then you can turn that in by November 15th, and then you get a check back sometime in the winter. And so it's a really good option for folks that maybe just have a few weeds, or they just don't have the money for commercial applicators. They charge about 150 bucks an hour. So it's pretty expensive, and then they can charge materials on top of that. So we try to work with people to create like a cost-effective management as well.
Awesome. And then the next question, and this may have been back when you were talking about acetic acid or horticultural vinegar, but the question is, does the 20% vinegar solution take out thistle?
Well, it's basically a contact burn. So if you're looking at biennial thistles, if you get a good amount of that on the rosette, you can definitely probably kill it. Once it starts bolting and it's above 6 inches, it's going to be really hard to kill. You're going to have to use a lot of vinegar. And I've just seen case studies where it actually will kill soil microbes and stuff like that. So it's actually, it has a higher LD50. It's technically more toxic than a lot of the broadleaf herbicides that we recommend.
Yeah, and I think just to give everybody, I think typical white vinegar, which is acetic acid, is it like 4%, 5% acetic acid, whereas this, 20%. Now it's heavy duty strength. So that strength, 20%, you just have to be really careful with it, not only just for the soil, but also for you as an applicator, other plants nearby. But Ben, I think is right that it definitely seems to work much better on those young, tender seedlings than it does on a little bit more established plants.
And there are new products coming out that are organic, and like I said, I think they can work with smaller annuals and biennials. If you're talking about perennials, I just don't think it's any better than just pulling it, and it's kind of expensive. Like I said, it's 85% of the plant mass is underground, so you really got to target that underground root system, or you just got to commit to just working it every 2 weeks for up to 5 years.
And just to continue with thistles, maybe just to get a clarification as far as which are the biennial thistles,
Sure.
and then perennial, annual.
Yeah, so they're typically mainly just biennial and perennial. So there's musk thistle, there's Scotch thistle, those are in the presentations. There's also bull thistle, but it's not very common. It's not really a big issue, but it is a non-native. I believe the natives are typically biennials as well. So the natives typically have white flowers. So if you see a thistle with a white flower, it's okay. It's been in this area for forever, and it's not going to just blow up like some of these other thistles. The Canada thistle, that's the perennial. So that's the one that gets really deep in the ground, and it's everywhere, unfortunately.
And then Ben, have you seen any studies in terms of glyphosate and pollinators, native bee populations?
I can't really speak directly about that. I know that most herbicides are actually fairly safe with pollinators. It's actually the surfactants that are harsh on the bugs, and so that surfactant, that non-ionic surfactant, that crop seed oil, what happens is it's so sticky that the bugs will actually get stuck to it. You can avoid that if you can target those plants before they flower. So if you're hitting stuff at that bud stage or past, like in the fall time, you can treat those perennials to get that downward nutrient flow. Those flowers have already seeded out; they're not doing their thing anymore. And so, ideally, if you can get them before that flower stage, and I'd like to say about the biennials. So they come up the first year as a rosette, and the second year it comes up as a bolted flowering plant. So if you can get those rosettes in the fall time, or pretty much any time before they flower, but some people think, oh, it's fall time, there's nothing left to do. Um, it's actually a great time to spray systemic herbicides for those perennials, but it's also a great time to dig up and target those biennials that haven't turned into those bolted flowering plants.
I think that's a
And
good point. That
it just takes experience trying to identify it. Most people are really good at identifying plants when they're flowering, and so just being able to identify the plant at all growth stages really helps you out.
and I think now with the cameras on phones, I mean, as you walk around and you can identify something, or you knew what was there before, you see the skeleton of last year's plants, and you see the young rosettes of this year's plants, or the new tender leaves coming up. Take a photo, snap a photo, and kind of remember what those look like. Because again, and I've seen some stuff now with bees and glyphosate. Maybe there can be an accumulation, a potential accumulation in the gut of a honeybee or in a native bee, causing damage for sure. So again, just another reason why we don't need to spray, that during that period of bloom, right? It's not the best time to spray, just for control itself, but also potentially for some of our pollinators. So just,
Yeah.
again, being able to identify some of these weeds like right now, remember where your cheatgrass was, right? And then see where it's all coming up probably right now in many places across, your property or the county. So right now is a great time to get out, and pulling weeds is easier now. Spraying weeds, identifying weeds, everything is much easier right now.
But it's hard. There's times when people bring in plants that have no flowers, and we just
Yeah.
see like some stems and leaves, and there's probably thousands of plants in our county. We're pretty good about the invasives, but it's hard to identify just random plants without that flower. So
Yeah.
it can be difficult. So like just paying attention to what happens throughout the season, and looking at the skeletons, and maybe even putting like a pin flag or two out in these areas where you had a certain type of weed could help out.
Yeah. If you bring me a grass to try to identify without something attached, some sort of reproductive structure, I struggle mightily. Even with the reproductive structures, I struggle. So there's it's tough to identify.
Sure.
I do have one more question here in chat about Queen Anne's lace. Someone was
Yeah.
told that Queen Anne's lace is a noxious weed. Is that true?
Yeah, technically it is a noxious weed. It's not native. I knew Rod was very concerned about it. It looks kind of similar to kind of that like that wild carrot kind of type of
Mm-hmm.
plant. And yeah, it can be invasive. Right now, it's not an A, B, C listed weed. So if you have some of that, just keep track of it. If you see it expanding, then you might want to get rid of it.
Yeah, and make sure that's one of those tough ones too that you make sure identify correctly. It could be a wild parsley, it could be the wild carrot, it could be some of those same similar plants that have that, the umbel shape, upside down umbrella shaped flower. So while it may resemble Queen Anne's lace, especially those of you, um, probably from the Northeast, upper Midwest, I can relate to some of our natives do look similar to that.
Yeah, and then there's even high country plants that look similar, like osha and
Yeah,
cow parsnip.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Cow
but
parsnip
that's high
goes crazy
country.
up high. Yeah, up high.
Yeah, that's more high country. I don't know of any poison hemlock or Queen Anne's lace that's above 8,000 feet, probably.
So Kat asks, is Southwest Seed on Casey Lane? That's actually Durango Nursery on Casey Lane, but they do rep Southwest Seed product. Southwest Seed is out in Dolores.
Yeah.
The best way to get in touch with them and see all their stuff is just go online. They have a good online portal, and descriptions of what they have, and then just give them a call because they can customize any sort of revegetation mix for you.
Yeah, it's a great resource. I didn't even know that they were a source for Southwest Seed Company. So I was kind of directing people more over there. But it's a great thing to have in town, and they have just so many different seed mixes, and they really know their stuff.
Excellent. So I'll leave it up for what one more is mallow and noxious weed.
It is, yeah. What's not cheeseweed is another name for it. Yeah, it's very common in gardens and lawns and stuff like that. Um, Man, I don't even know if it's an annual or biennial or perennial. It's generally not like a range weed. It's definitely not a listed weed for the state or the county, but it's very, very common. Um, might even be edible. I don't know.
It is a pain. It is a long taprooted plant for sure.
Okay.
But it's a pain. All right. Any other questions?
I just wanted to say, Darren and Ben, my name is Jim. I just sent you guys an email. Look forward to meeting you. Thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, no
Yeah,
problem.
my pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ben.
We're a good resource.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, anytime, give us a call or email.
All right, y'all. You all have a nice evening. Again, this will be recorded. I know there's lots of pictures and hard to identify, so just go to laplataextension.org and you'll see a recording of this. Take care.
Thanks. Have a good night, guys.